They were still talking in their communities. And of course, it was an era when people respected the wisdom of age far more than we do today. It's worth pointing out that our part of the world was particularly badly affected by the English Civil War. Now, if your history was the same as mine, you could probably reel off the big 5 battles of the English Civil War. But what we all tend to forget is just how much in the wider local conflict there was, how the land was fought over, how both sides were trying to exert their influence to extract taxes, seize property, seize guns, seize horses, food, and whatever. And unfortunately for Somerset and our part of the world, it really was a no man's land. And what you've got is, if I can get this to work, the king was at Oxford. That was his headquarters for the duration of the English Civil War. And the West Country, particularly Cornwall and Devon, were strongly pro-royalist. There was also a lot of supplies and support coming from South Wales. Of course, the way it would come would be by water across the Bristol Channel. So places like Bristol, Bridgewater, along the coast here, these ports were very important from that point of view. But equally, our area lay directly on the route between the king and his supporters in the west. A no man's land. The towns were broadly, very broadly, for Parliament, and the countryside very broadly was for the king. So it was precisely a tinderbox in terms of local conflicts. No big battles necessarily, but a lot of small local skirmishes and so on. And of course, Bristol itself, at that time, was the second richest city in the country after London, which is quite an important fact to bear in mind, because again, it was a major prize for either side, and of course it did change hands during the English Civil War. So all the legacy of that was still extant when the Duke of Monmouth invaded. As I say, these events are something for us in history books. To the people living then, they were real. They were, and the context I would put it in, perhaps if you think back to, say, the miners' strike in 1985, which is about the same time ago as we're talking about. And if you go to some of the mining communities in Northumberland and so on, I suspect that the attitudes there towards people like Margaret Thatcher and the Conservative Party would reflect to some degree the way Somerset felt about the King in London. Of course, I suspect there was a generation divide, that young men did not necessarily share the views or the zeal of their fathers, and it was a complicated picture, but that's where we headed for. The religious element is very important. I mean, different authors put different emphasis on it, but Somerset, for reasons too complicated for me to go into tonight, was very strongly a centre for dissident religion, low church effectively, a legacy again of the Puritanism of the English Civil War. And again, that very much reflects the attitude to London, to the nobility, to the established church.
I want to look at that big map if I can. I want to look at that big map.
Right, let's move on. Right, and this religious aspect is strongly coming through in terms of Monmouth's aims, what he declared that he was invading for. Crucial. It's worthwhile saying again that the restoration of Charles II had been really bad news for Low Church people, that Charles himself, as you probably know, on his deathbed, officially converted to Catholicism, but the whole of the establishment had been fairly high church and anathema to many of the religious adherents down in this part of the world. There'd also been a major attempt to suppress Presbyterian and Baptist congregations in places like Taunton, that the mayor of Taunton in 1684, 1685 had been very active in attacking their meetings, burning the furniture and so on and so forth. So, Duke of Monmouth arrives in this little port of Lyme Regis, and essentially people in the neighbourhood flock to his banner. That when he left Lyme Regis, it's estimated that he may have had something like 3,000 supporters following him already at that point. Word spread very fast in the area, and people flocked from the surrounding area to join him. The local defence for the Royalists lay in the hands of the local militias. Each county had a militia made up of people who had to serve 2 weeks a year for training and so on. Very much designed against foreign invasion, but as you might expect, over the years, the whole institution had decayed, that their guns had gone rusty, they'd lost the keys to some of their armouries, this sort of thing. And they won't say it, that the 2 weeks were, if they were met up at all, were perhaps more of a good pub crawl than much in the way of military training. The militia was alerted and did come out, but was totally ineffective at defeating this marching army of 3,000 odd people. And indeed, some of the militia did actually swap sides and join. And again, it's perhaps not surprising, because what you're talking about are Englishmen being asked to attack and fight people from their same village, from their same county. And obviously that's the sort of thing that would stick in the gullet if you could get away with it.
Oh, thank you for getting it going.
By contrast, the Crown had a small but highly professional standing army based in London. There were about 6,000 men in this army, which obviously by modern standards is tiny. And even by then, about half of them were actually in the Low Countries fighting the continental wars that were going on at the time. But, as I've said previously, James II was an ex-military man. He knew his way around military matters, and he was a good one at attending to detail. He wasn't like his brother at all. And he was very, very effective with his advisors in getting the army moving quickly towards the West Country. He got the cavalry coming down first with strict instructions not to have a battle, but to limit the ability of the rebels to enlist more people or to forage in the countryside for supplies. And in that, they were actually very effective.
I'm just thinking that many people
The infantry of those days usually marched at something like 12 to 15 miles a day. So as you can see, it was going to be a week and a half or so before the force arrived from London in any fit state to have a pitched battle. But as I say, it was a very effective mobilisation, and you really have got to give credit to the King for that. It's quite interesting that the force was under the command of Churchill, later the Duke of Marlborough, who went on obviously to have much greater battles than this one. But the victory of Blenheim really started his military career in this thing. The reception of the Duke of Monmouth, as I said, was ecstatic. There's a rather stylised picture of him being acclaimed by the towns. He moved forward to Taunton, moved up the country to Taunton, where at that stage Taunton was a rich town. It was a centre for the textile industry, about 6,000 people there. So what should we say, 4 or 5 times the size of Blagden. He entered the town to a tumultuous welcome. It really was parades everywhere, wine and beer flowing, the full works. And at the Market Cross, he was declared king. Quite important insofar as I've already indicated, a lot of the general people were anti-monarchist. So this was a fairly dangerous strategy. But by then, it was totally clear that the nobles, the squireocracy of the area, were not joining him. The local gentry were sitting on their hands, and he thought at the time this might be that they feared a return to the Commonwealth. So it was a balancing act, should they, shouldn't they?
Mm.
Many men joined his ranks from the town of Taunton, but there was still no sign of support from elsewhere in the country, particularly London. Sorry, I shouldn't have come on this. One of the little twists in their adulation of Monmouth when he came into Taunton was that there was a school for the daughters of the great and the good of the town. Because obviously in those days only the rich could afford to educate their daughters. And these young women were encouraged by their schoolmistress to embroider flags for Monmouth, which they presented to him with great ceremony. And we will come on later what the implications of that were, what the repercussions of that were for those unfortunate young ladies and their fathers. But these are the sort of flags that they were presented him with. This was Monmouth's motto, fear nothing but God, again reflecting the importance of religion in this whole dissident rebellion. People have made all sorts of estimates as to what proportion of the rebels were dissidents in religious sense, and some people have come up as high as about 2/3 of them. This is a map of the course that Monmouth took. Now we're getting ahead of ourselves a bit, but it's convenient to put it onto the one map. The red line is the route he took heading northwards. So as you can see, he essentially zigzagged along the main road network, much as it is today, up through Axminster, Chard, Ilminster, Taunton, and came on up the A38 to Bridgewater, across to Shepton Mallet, up to Glastonbury, Shepton Mallet, and then up to Keynsham. Now, the strategy behind that lay in the fact, as I've said earlier, that Bristol was a key city in the country, and the strategy was to seize Bristol. If you've got control of Bristol, you've got all its wealth at your disposal, the armaments, the ships, the recruits that it would provide, and it was an easily defended, well-defended location, which would provide a real headache to any army trying to seize it back. So the plan was to head north and attack Bristol. So he's going through the Mendips, not that far from Blagden. The reason for heading for Keynsham is quite simple. That Bristol at the time was pretty well defended. It's still got its old town walls and so on, but it was far easier to attack from the north side, the Gloucester side, than the south. And the reason for that, quite simply, was the River Avon, that the Avon provided a significant natural defence to the south. And so the plan was to cross